Welcome to Circuosity.21. I'm Jim Strader-Sasser, and I'm one of your hosts. I'm here today with my podcast and life companion, the Reverend Dr. Hal, or Howie Sasser, and together we're delighted that you are joining us. Circuosity.21 is our pulpit for exploring ancient and contemporary spiritual and moral themes. We engage topics with curiosity. We honor wisdom we have received from sages, prophets, martyrs, and saints from millennia ago. We enjoy learning from our friends, listeners, and especially from teachers who help us understand life better. One of our objectives as Episcopal priest is to become more spiritually alive while living more joyously and sharing what we learn with you. So welcome to our pilgrimage and thank you for traveling along with us. This is the second episode of our podcast series on the Beatitudes. And if you didn't catch our first episode, please take a listen. It's on the website as well as on Podbean. We are just thrilled to have someone that I would say is a beloved professor and teacher of mine who I had the great pleasure of spending some time with at Vanderbilt more than a couple of years ago. So we welcome Professor Amy Jill Levine to the podcast. She is presently the University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies and the Mary Jane Wortham Professor of Jewish Studies, and also the Professor of New Testament
I've
Studies.
got a lot of titles, but it's, people can look me up. That's fine. Okay. If I weren't qualified, I wouldn't be here.
So beyond the titles, just tell us a little bit about who you are. Where's your context, and how did you get to be this wonderful teacher and academician that you are?
Oh, because I got blessed, obviously. I'm originally from Massachusetts. I did an undergraduate major in religion and English at Smith College, fabulous women's college. Went off to do an MA and PhD at Duke and some postdoctoral studies at Brown University. Taught for 9 years at Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia, fabulous liberal arts institution, and then got bought by Vanderbilt, where I have been for close to 30 years.
Wow.
Do you find that your student population is pretty steady? Are people still going into the study of religion?
Oh, what a great question. Not as many as before. When I first got to Vanderbilt, the entering classes, both Masters of Theological Studies and Masters of Divinity, were over 100. And we took in last year and this year, and part of this is COVID, but part of it is simply decline in enrollment. We took in under 50 students. So I fear about the training, particularly of liberal Protestant pastors, the ongoing vitality of university-based divinity schools, which are not supported by denominational funds. Because I think it's good that people who are, Lutheran talk to people who are Episcopalian, who talk to people who are Catholic, who talk to people who are Eastern Orthodox, who talk to a bunch of Baptists. That's helpful. And if we're just left with denominational seminaries, that's going to go away.
So, and I'm sure we're going to hear your interpretation of the word blessed, but I think it's always helpful, now that we kind of know where you came from, if you can think of one or two blessed moments in your life where you truly felt blessed, however you would define that.
It's very hard to define, because when I think about blessing, I tend to think about some sort of divine hand entering in. But I'm not much of a theologian, so it might just be serendipity. It might be luck. It might be just good fortune. And I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my life. My father died when I was quite young, which was obviously not fortunate, but I had a very wise, helpful guide as a mom. So my own sense of how I was raised, both my childhood memories of my dad, which brings out questions of blessed are those who are mourn, the idea of remembering somebody who has been dead for decades. And my mom, who provided me the guidance that I needed and provided me the entree into academic concerns in which I had interest, because I'm an only child and my mother was 44 when I was born. Um, and her view was anything this little girl wanted that had some sort of academic merit, she was going to make sure that happened. So if I wanted a book, I could get the book, whether my own book or usually a trip to the library. If I wanted to go to a museum, she would make sure that that would happen. If there were people in the town who were doing something that I was interested in, she would set up little luncheons so that, she would have tea with her friend, but I would get to ask questions. So rather than being seen and not heard, she allowed her daughter both to be seen and to be heard. And because of my mother's own strength, I grew up with a sense of, yes, you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. No, you don't have to, lose at tennis because you want the boy to like you or whatever that was. Just be who you are. I was also really well mentored, both in my undergraduate education and in my graduate education, by faculty who said, "Okay, it's weird that this Jewish woman wants to study Jesus, but she seems to be okay about this. I mean, she's not questioning her own religious tradition. She's not having some sort of breakdown, nor is she having a conversion experience. She's just really interested in the academics. Let's make sure these things happen." I was lucky to get the job at Swarthmore. I never thought they were going to hire me. I'm the first woman ever hired into that religion department. I was lucky to get the job at Vanderbilt. I didn't think they were going to hire me because who's going to hire a Jew to teach New Testament to people who want to be Christian ministers in Nashville? I mean, but lucky things happen. Jim, I'm lucky I got to meet you when you came to Vanderbilt because you didn't stay there. But somehow we managed to retain our friendship. That's all terrific. It's luck. It's serendipity.
I am.
I love that.
The older I get, the less I believe in luck. I think there is more and more divine providence in the little nudges of our lives. It isn't when we're slapped on the side of the head with a 2x4 so much as when things happen that I think the divine hand is much less apparent than we might imagine.
In the book of Esther, in the Hebrew version of Esther, God is never mentioned, but the commentaries read God's hand in everything all the way through. So if you begin with a theological lens, you're likely to see the hand of God there. If you don't have a theological lens, you might not, but you know what, your friends might.
You just have to hope your friends aren't Job's friends, I guess.
Yeah, that would not be terribly helpful. But you know what, my friends, they're pretty clued into why Job's friends don't quite make it. And here again, I've been fortunate or blessed or whatever. I'm not sitting on a dung heap, having lost my spouse and my children and having my body riddled with sores, and scratching myself with a part shard. So circumstances do differ.
In your book, you mentioned Karl Donfried, who knew the history of the New Testament and knew the history of the fact that, as you wrote, Jesus is not a Christian talking to other Christians. He is a Jew talking to other Jews. He has insight into the heart of Torah, and they would do well to listen to him. So we're going to have a listening audience, I would imagine, of everything from someone who can probably spell Matthew, maybe knows that it's in the New Testament, all the way over to people who are very familiar and much more knowledgeable about Matthew than I am. So let's begin with talking about this second temple context and environment that Jesus is teaching in. Can you give us a flyby about what that setting looks like?
Yeah. So here's the basic flyby. The term Second Temple refers to Jewish culture, life, theology, everything. From the return from Babylonian exile, which is in 538, all the way up to the 1st century. Technically, the Second Temple, the one, it was built they started to rebuild it around 515 or so. And you can see in the prophets Haggai and Zechariah that it didn't look like much. Because there was that glorious Solomonic temple, and then there was this kind of redo. But King Herod the Great, who's the one who kills the babies in the Gospel of Matthew, so he's like the bad guy in Matthew at the beginning, decided to rebuild the temple in part as a tourist attraction. And the whole thing was still under construction, even at the time that Jesus and his initial followers were there. They finished it in the 60s, and it got burned down by Rome in the year 70. So when we talk about Second Temple period, we're talking here regarding Jesus about the late Second Temple period. And specifically for Jesus, we're talking about the 20s and 30s of the Common Era. Matt Era, E-R-A. I'm from Massachusetts. I tend to throw R's on the end of words where they don't belong, like idea. And I don't want people to think I'm saying Common Error, E-R-R-O-R. It's Common Era, which is just a non-sectarian way of saying BC and or AD. The Gospel of Matthew was written slightly after that, probably in the 80s or 90s, in the Common Era. What's life like? It's remarkably diverse because there's no head Jew. And if there were a head Jew, the Jews wouldn't pay attention anyway, right? Because we already saw that with Moses. So you've got lots of different movements, some of which are mentioned already in the New Testament, like Sadducees and Pharisees. You've got scribes, you've got zealots. You've got the folks responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that represents a couple of 100 years worth of material. You've got people who are highly assimilated and people who aren't assimilated at all. You've got folks living in the hill country, and you've got folks living in urban areas. You've got folks in the Jewish world in Galilee who speak Aramaic, and in Judea who speak both Aramaic and Greek. And then in the diaspora, places outside the land of Israel where there were Jews, who were speaking Aramaic in points east and Greek in points west. So Jewish life is remarkably diverse, and we might think, in terms of numerics, not so many, but think about like Americans today. So you've got Americans on the right, you've got Americans on the left, you've got American expatriates, you've got Americans who are immigrants who have taken out citizenship cards, you've got people who were sojourning in the land, as the Bible would put it, but they'll stay here for a while, like graduate students, and then go back to their home countries. And as diverse as America is, Jews are pretty much the same, have the same diversity. But there are certain things that they recognize, and there are certain things that hold them together. They have a sense of a common ancestry from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. They have a common general language, like Americans would think about common history, say like George Washington or the Pilgrims. They would have a common language, Hebrew, like we would have a common language, English, but a bunch of people wouldn't speak the language. They would have a common ethos, which for Jews would be the Torah, as for Americans, say the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. And they would know that they were Jews, which meant that they weren't Samaritans and they weren't Gentiles, just as Americans somehow know that they're Americans and not Japanese or German or Kenyan, although there may be some connection there one way or the other. Now, this also makes a difference in terms of recognizing Jewish life as part of a peoplehood, or the Greek would be ethnos, where we get terms like ethnic and ethnicity. If you're part of a peoplehood, you can argue and you can disagree on pretty much everything. But at the end of the day, you still have to deal with each other because you're all the same people. And that's one of the things that I have to explain to my students, because they tend to think of Jews and Christians along the same lines, as if we're both religions, and we're not. So one was not born a follower of Jesus, one became a follower of Jesus as one became a Pharisee or one became an Essene. It's like joining a voluntary association. And when you join a voluntary association, either the Girl Scouts or the Masons or the Moose or the Knights of Columbus, whatever, you play by their particular rules. And if you don't play by their rules, you're either going to leave because you're disaffected, or they're going to throw you out because you've done something wrong. And therefore, when you join one of these associations, there tends to be less debate and less controversy, because you need to hold yourself together by belief, rather than you're holding yourself together simply because you're there naturally as part of a nation. So when we hear Jesus debate with fellow Jews, that doesn't take him out of the system. That puts him right in the middle of the system. Because one of the things that Jews are known for, and you can already see this in the scriptures of Israel, is they're known for debating. God gives the law and says, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then one Jew looks at another and says, how? Now you have debate. That's part of the culture.
You think that's still true? This is a bit off the topic, but I'm interested in your opinion. After the 20th century, I had a professor when I was at the University of Pittsburgh who was an observant Jew, who said, we are Jews because other people say that we are.
I think that's a very helpful definition. We are who we are in part because of who we think we are, and we are who we are in part because of what other people think about us. And that's particularly the case if you're a member of a minoritized group. So if you're a person of color, if you identify as LGBTQI+, a member of the queer community, if you speak with an accent, if you were visibly disabled, right? So people start projecting all sorts of stuff on you. And then you have to determine whether you're going to reflect back what's being projected or whether you're going to refract it. So you're always being determined not only by what your own group tells you, what your own family tells you, but also by engaging with others. And so I think your professor had a very wise thing to say. In part, Jews are Jews because other people know we're Jews. And even if we try to deny being Jews, we're still Jews. As if it's somehow a racialized thing. And it doesn't matter. I mean, there are lots and lots of Jews of color. There are lots and lots of Jews who can pass as white. In American society, the saying had been Jews are white, but not quite. When we moved to Nashville from outside of Philadelphia, we were given the information that there were certain neighborhoods where our children would probably not be as welcome as they would be in other neighborhoods. Right? And this is still the case. So you deal with those external perceptions. And that would be the case in antiquity as well. So that when
that was my next question.
Right,
when Jesus and his followers see themselves in the same way.
Because we have from the same Second Temple period or slightly after, we have comments from pagans talking about Jews, sometimes quite complimentary, but sometimes in a quite nasty way. Jews are a very large community in Alexandria in Egypt, which is why I have so many Jews named Alexander, by the way, including my son, although he was named for my husband's Aunt Elsie. In any case, they had certain privileges as a kind of good minority group. And there are lots of anti-Jewish polemic that one finds from pagans over against Jews. So there was an old polemic that said, oh, the Exodus story that you're all telling, no, you were all diseased and you got thrown out of the country. So, even in antiquity, people are taking other people's history and spinning them negatively, and people then have to react to that. And we know about this in part because of the first century Jewish historian Josephus, who writes a book against some of these pagan polemics.
So, Kingdom of Heaven and Matthew sort of come together like hand in glove.
I thought you were going to say ham and cheese, and that would have been the wrong metaphor.
No, I was dancing on my feet. Matthew, you have spent long periods of time with Matthew. Talk to us about Matthew.
Matthew, yes. I wrote my dissertation on Matthew, and that was done in 1984. So I've been living with Matthew longer than I've been living with my kids, with almost longer than I've been living with my spouse. And I talk to Matthew, and I will sometimes say, Matthew, did you intend something? And Matthew usually responds, well, I can see where you get it. And so I think Matthew is coming out of some sort of Jewish environment. Why? Because Matthew knows post-biblical Jewish and Bible interpretation, right? Matthew knows certain things that Jews are doing. But that does not mean that Matthew is writing to Jews. So determining who an author is not the same thing as determining who an audience is. Paul is clearly Jewish, but Paul's target audiences are Gentiles, or pagans, if you will. So I don't think Matthew's writing to a specific community. I see no reason why to presume that, because the text is not a community. I think Matthew's writing to anybody who would read Matthew. I think Matthew may well be writing to people who have read Mark to say, okay, now that you've read Mark, let me make some clarifications for you. And I think you can say the same thing about Mark and about Luke and about John. And so there's no reason to limit them to some sort of narrow conventicle. Is Matthew taking things from Matthew's own environment? Absolutely. But nor is Matthew restricted to this. So here's one of the dirty secrets of biblical studies. What happens? We read the gospel, and then we determine the identity of the author and the audience on the basis of the gospel content. And now we read the gospel content again on the basis of the audience and authorial identity we've just determined. That's called a circular argument. And that makes me very nervous. So we know by manuscript attestation, by citation from church fathers and so on, Matthew was the most popular gospel in the church, and the church was by then the Gentile church. So even if Matthew were writing to some narrow group of Jews who had decided to follow Jesus, that text went Gentile very, very quickly. So why limit it? Oh, here's another way of thinking about it. So the old model went, Matthew was writing to a bunch of Jewish believers in Jesus who hated Gentiles and didn't want Gentiles to have anything to do with them. And Matthew was writing to convince them to be universalistic. So what have we done now? We've invented a xenophobic Jewish community over against which to read a positive universalistic Jesus in the church. And that's simply inventing a false perception of Judaism. Because what do we know about Judaism in the first century? Well, this temple that Herod rebuilt, the outer court was called the Court of the Gentiles because, again, it was a tourist attraction. And Gentiles were welcome to worship there. If you were xenophobic, if you didn't want anything to do with Gentiles, if you thought Gentiles were hopelessly impure and sinful, why would you welcome them into the holiest place in your entire system? That makes no sense. And we know that Gentiles are also affiliating with Jewish synagogues, which is not the temple. Synagogues are all over, temples just in Jerusalem. The technical term for this is God-fearer. So they're basically Gentiles who really like the Jewish ethos, the way of doing things. They probably like the reading from scripture, because in antiquity, if you old was good, actually, I'm old and old is fabulous. So if you could get yourself back to creation, that was terrific. If you had a reputation for having really good ethics, as Jews in fact did, then Gentiles were hanging out with Jews, but some of them converted and some of them are thinking, well, at least the men, circumcision, not really an option for me, but I really like these folks. I want to hang out with them.
Boil it down to your elevator speech. What is the project of Matthew?
Matthew is writing to what I suspect is a mixed community of Jews and Gentiles, and perhaps some Samaritans, although I doubt it, attempting to tell them, here is the blueprint for how you live as a follower of Jesus. Here's what he did, and here's how you follow him so that you can be a good follower. Here's basically your foundation document or your constitution that tells you who you are, where you came from, how you relate to Jesus, and then how you live in the world as you wait for him to return.
So Matthew is forming a community.
Matthew is writing to a community that's already formed and helping to shape them. Okay, so thanks for that clarification. Again, think about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. The community was already there. But then you have to put into words, well, what exactly do we stand for? What are our foundation principles? Who are we? Who are we the people? And what if you join us? Would you be expected to know and expected to do?
Matthew is very fond of mountain scenes.
Matthew loves mountains. Seven mountain scenes.
7 mountains. And what I find interesting in these first two is that the first mountain scene is a scene of wilderness, a scene of trial. This second scene is, no kidding, Jesus going to a high place as Moses did and comes back down with teachings that are signature-like, if you will.
Yeah. So the part of the temptation narrative, and it's an extended temptation narrative, it shows up in both Matthew and Luke, but in different order, is that Satan takes Jesus to this high mountain and shows him all the nations of the world. If you think the earth is flat, it works. If you think the earth is round, you get eye strain. And says, if you worship me, you can have all this stuff, which is that's a huge problem, because is the offer bona fide? Does Satan really have all these kingdoms of the world to give, which says something about the kingdoms of the world? And Jesus responds, worship only the Lord your God, quoting here Deuteronomy. And then for Matthew, that would not be only God the Father. That would, for Matthew, also be Jesus the Son. It's a double line here, at which point Satan gives up, at least for the time being. In the end of the Gospel of Matthew, back up on a mountain in Galilee, Jesus says to the 11 disciples who were left, because Judas has hanged himself, now that all authority has been given to me, I've got it all now anyway. Satan promised it. He's defeated. I've got it. Therefore, your job is to go from this high mountain to all the nations of the world, teaching them everything that I've taught you. And Matthew adds a new initiation model, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Oh yeah, it's Matthew knows how to frame stuff. In the chapter 1 in Matthew, which is the Christmas story, Joseph finds out that his fiancee is pregnant, which is never good news. But then he gets a dream. Well, of course he gets a dream because his father's name is Jacob, his name is Joseph, and we saw that already in Genesis. So Joseph gets a dream, and in the dream, an angel says to him, "Listen, don't be afraid to take Mary for your wife. The child is conceived by the Holy Spirit." At that point, I would have asked for the details, but Joseph doesn't. And this was to fulfill what was said by the prophet, because Matthew footnotes everything. Behold, a virgin will conceive and she will bear a child, and you will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So the name Emmanuel really does mean God with us. It's from Isaiah chapter 7. And the last verse in the Gospel of Matthew says, Jesus says to the guys up on the mountain, "Look, I am with you even to the end of the age." So you have this beautiful framing of the palpable presence of the Christ, and thus of the palpable presence of God, always with the people, even though we don't see him. So Matthew likes to organize things very, very, very neatly. So Jesus' greatest hits, you get the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus' greatest hits. How to run a mission, chapter 10. Bunch of parables, chapter 13. So they're neatly collected. How to run a church, chapter 18. What happens at the end of the world, 24 and 25. So Matthew's like this early Christian handbook. I mean, I guess the technical term would be a catechism, telling you how to do all this stuff. And it's interspersed with, Christmas and Passion and Easter and controversy, stories, and miracles. Matthew knows what he's doing. And the cool thing about Matthew is if you read Matthew once and then you read Matthew again, you start seeing things you didn't see the last time. So I think Matthew, like Genesis or like Judges or like Esther or like Ruth, I think these books are intended to be read over and over and over again. So that for me, and I've been reading Matthew again for decades, each time I read it, each time I teach it, I see new things. My students ask questions I hadn't asked. I come up with new ideas, because that's what a good story does. And Matthew was one heck of a good story.
Does that then alter the idea, the sort of sense of a chronology of the story? I mean, I'm interested in knowing who Jesus is when he's doing the Sermon on the Mount. Is he a rabbi? Is he a bumpkin from the country who came in with some clever words? Is he already Moshiach? Who is he at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question, Howie. Thank you. He's all that. And he's going to be more than all that when you read it the second time, because then you know really who he is, and you start getting details about he's the Son of Man, and then he's the resurrected one, and then he's the one with all authority. Oh, now let's go back and read the Sermon on the Mount. But when you get to the Sermon on the Mount, we know that the crowds are following him. Why? Because he's been healing people, right? I mean, because if you get up on a mountain and you go, blessed are the poor, and like, who cares? But if you can cure a bunch of people and then you say blessed, like I'm in there, right? And maybe when he comes down, he can take care of my sciatica. So he's all those things. I think the historical Jesus. So get back behind Matthew and get to Jesus, because what we get Jesus refracted from memory and from oral tradition and from what the gospel writers wanted to make clear. So they probably added words to Jesus for clarification. I think one of the hard facts, if we can even talk about that, is that he was a healer and he was an exorcist and he was known for that. And that's a great way of gathering crowds. And it may actually help explain who Jesus thought he was himself. Because if he is able to cast out Satan, if he did have a vision, Matthew and Luke record him saying, "I saw Satan fall like," Luke says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Right? If it's by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. I think he thought he was part of this cosmic battle and that he was winning, right? And the more wins you get, the more powerful you feel, and the more you become convicted of your own sense of who you are. So in Mark chapter 8, Matthew picks this up in Matthew 16, Jesus says to the guys, and they're in Matthew, they're of course are on another mountain. "Who do people say that I am?" It's, "Oh, you're one of the prophets." Like, that's pretty good. And that could account for some of the miracle working, because the prophet Elijah did miracles and the prophet Elisha did miracles. And there was a sense in antiquity among some Jews that when the Messianic age broke in, it would be the prophet Elijah who would come to announce it. So could he have been one of the prophets like Elijah? Sure, he sounds kind of like Zechariah. He sounds a little bit like Jeremiah, and he's going to sound more like Jeremiah in the temple incident. And then Peter finally says, you're the Messiah. The Greek here is Christos. The Hebrew would be, as Howie suggested, Mashiach, Messiah, which means the anointed one. But even there, we've got problems because we've got a title, but now we have to put a job description to it. Right? So once you say you're the Christ or you're the Messiah, and Peter would not have said Christ, that's a Greek term, then what does that mean? Are you the person who ushers in the Messianic age? That was the standard view. Are you also divine? Well, most people didn't think the Messiah was a divine figure. We have other Messianic figures in antiquity, and they're all human. Are you somebody who is possessed by the divine? And Jesus might himself have thought that. Think about the baptism where he has this experience of the Holy Spirit descending on him. So in a way that's similar to people can be possessed by Satan, people can also be in effect possessed by the Holy Spirit. And then their actions are what the Holy Spirit wants them to do. Just as if you're possessed by Satan, you do what Satan's minions want you to do. So this whole question of what does it mean to be the Messiah is fraught. Jesus does not claim that title for himself generally. He doesn't say, hi, I'm the Messiah. Although in the Gospel of John, he does walk around going, hi, I'm the light of the world. I mean, he is somewhat self-promoting. But in the Synoptic Gospels, he calls himself Son of Man. And that's also another problem, because Son of Man could mean just I, like the English one. You know, one did an interview this morning with two nice fellows. It can be an apocalyptic redeemer figure, that's Daniel chapter 7, or it could be somebody who's known for being not terribly important, like, you know, God says to Ezekiel, oh, son of man, can these bones live? Like, Ezekiel, your prophet, what do you know? So is Jesus making a messianic claim for himself? Is he saying, I'm just a human being? Is he saying, I'm less than a human being? Here's where Matthew was helpful. Go back to the prediction to Joseph, and they call him Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. And the name Yeshua in Hebrew, which is where Jesus comes from, Jesus is the anglicized version of the Greek Jesus, which is the Greekified version of the Hebrew Yeshua. It's the same name as Hosea or Joshua or Hosanna, and it means to save.
So he has all these people gathered around him for this speech, as Matthew portrays it, who have probably come to him in part because they find something attractive in him in terms of what he can do for them.
Yep.
So when he begins speaking, are they then looking at him as the miracle worker who has something to say today? Or are they looking at him as someone who's giving them advice about how to live? Or is he telling them about who they are? Are the Beatitudes prescriptive or descriptive?
Yeah. I love the way you framed the question. You set it up as an either or. And pretty much every time I talk to Matthew and I say, is it this or is it that? And Matthew goes, yes.
Yes.
So I tend to think in either or models too. And I continually find myself being corrected by Jesus or Matthew, who wants me to get out of that binary and be a little bit more fluid in the way that I read. So Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount is delivered to the disciples. It's the people who are standing around the mountain who are the listeners in. So now we've got two separate audiences. I keep thinking back to Monty Python's Life of Brian, where the people in the back are going, blessed are the cheese makers. And somebody responds, well, it's all makers of dairy products. I mean, that's such a great read. Such a great read. So he's talking to the disciples, but that's actually, I think, an invitation to the people who are listening. Do you want to be one of these disciples? Do you want to climb up this mountain and be here with us and be transformed in this mountaintop experience? Or do you just want to stay at the foot of the mountain and say, well, that was interesting, and then go home, or go find your own mountain? Because I don't think everybody's climbing up the same mountain anyway. I don't think Christians are climbing up the same mountain as Jews, and they're not climbing up the same mountain as Islam. I think we all have our own mountains. So we have to determine how would the disciples have received this, and then how would the audience on the other side have received it? And the answer is necessarily going to be differently. So some of it is probably descriptive. Blessed are you poor, because yours is the kingdom of heaven. Already, you know that God has special care for you. And part of the sense of being blessed with that theological concern, and Howie, this goes back to your definition, is that God is paying attention to you and God knows what you need and God is hearing your prayers. And even though it may seem that God is absent, or even in the Job model that God is somehow punishing you because you're in bad situation, there's still a sense that God knows you as God, as the shepherd knows the sheep, one by one, that pass through the sheepfold, which is an image both in the Gospel of John and, in fact, in rabbinic literature. So that's a descriptive. And some of it may be both. Because if peacemakers are blessed, then you might realize that being a peacemaker might be a good thing. And if the meek are blessed, and meek doesn't mean kind of cowering or mousy. Meek, praus in Greek, has a sense of you're a person in a position of authority, but you give up that authority in order to help others.
Is it kenotic?
Yeah, it can be. So when we talk about kenosis, oh, what a good theological term, show off. What a good theological term. So in what's called the Christ hymn in Philippians, although I'm not sure it's a hymn, in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, Paul talks about how Jesus was in the form of God, but didn't want to keep seizing onto that form, but he empties himself out. So he empties himself out of that divinity, and that's called kenosis. And he takes on the form even of a slave. Jesus never asked his followers to do anything that he would not do himself. And part of what happens in the Gospel of Matthew is after Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, he proceeds to live it. And he's already done some of that. So, and Joseph and Mary have already done some of that. So when you take the kenotic model of Jesus emptying himself out, as giving himself over to the cross, allowing that to happen, because he could have gotten away. He's saying to his followers, right, you can do the same thing that I am doing. I've given you the initial plug in the temptation narrative, where when the devil tempts me with all this stuff, I just pull out Deuteronomy, and that tells me what I'm supposed to do, right? So Deuteronomy, like the Pentateuch is the trump suit. Pentateuch is always going to trump Psalms or Proverbs, which is what the devil cites. And then he says, I'm going to give you the Sermon on the Mount. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm going to show you what it looks like to be the light of the world. I'm going to show you what it looks like, in fact, to pray in private. I'm going to show you what it looks like to teach appropriately and not to cast your pearls before swine. And I'm going to show you how appropriately you build your house on a firm foundation.
There is a quality of go and do likewise in it then.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's why I wanted to come back to salvation and saving, because he will save his people from their sins. And I think that's gotten retranslated, re-theologized, reinterpreted as if, well, Jesus has done all of these marvelous things, to include dying, so that we can get to heaven, which is some other magical place elsewhere. And I think you posit that we should understand the kingdom of heaven as being an incarnational living place where Jesus has been and continues to act, and we should act likewise.
It's a both and.
Okay. So, now it's my turn.
Yeah, because there is part of that. Yeah, he did die to save you from your sins, because he talks about, and this is Matthew as well as Mark, he talks about giving his life as a ransom for many. So there was this idea. There are multiple ideas about heaven and the afterlife in early Judaism. They never settled down to one particular view. That comes later in rabbinic sources. But there was one view that up in heaven there were these treasure boxes. Like in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Don't lay up treasure on earth where moth and rust can get at it. Like don't stick it in your mattress. Lay up treasure in heaven." Right? Well, that's a real metaphor, as if they're like safety deposit boxes, if they're bank accounts. And every time you sin, you draw down against the account. And because humankind has been sinning for a very long time, the accounts are pretty much emptied. And what Jesus does is dying as a ransom for many is refill those accounts. I'm drawing here on the work because I think you should credit to the scholars who influence you, of Gary Anderson and Nathan Eubank on how some of these metaphors function. So I do think that his death has some implication for questions of human standing in relationship to God, in relationship to sin and forgiveness. Part of what he's doing is he is pronouncing forgiveness of sins. I mean, you could get that elsewhere, like you would tone, but he provides a forum by which you might think about doing that. So he does die to save his people from their sins, but at the same time, he lives to show them how you get saved from your sins by how you act righteously and how you understand repentance. It's a both and. So all those people are saying Jesus died, I'm saved, la-di-da. They're missing the and part of the both and.
We
This is
turn to the meaning of blessed, to turn from something complicated to something even more complicated. Blessed, Makarios, Ashrei.
Yeah.
How should we
Yeah.
understand blessed in this context?
Oh, that's so hard. And again, you asked the best question. Because part of it is that, right, Jesus spoke Aramaic. We're reading this in Greek. It's translated into Greek, and now we're reading it in English. And it's like one of these games of telephone tag where, you know, every time you translate something, something comes in that doesn't belong there and something goes out that does belong there. So I don't know whether Jesus said Baruch, which means blessed. That's where we get words like Barack Obama. Or standard Jewish blessings over, you know, over a meal. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who something, something, something. Or whether he used Ashrei, which you mentioned, which means happy. So Macarius could have translated either one of them. So how do we translate Macarius? Is it blessed? That's okay. Is it happy? I'm not really happy with happy, because I find the idea of happy are you who are mourned to be, I find that offensive. Like, good for you. Right? You know, fortunate. There's a sense there that some of it might be, you know, fortunate are you that you are able to mourn, because some people can't, but that it still doesn't ring right. Praiseworthy, which is another way of doing it. The Australian good on you, that somehow God is here active in your life, even if you don't necessarily sense it. And God is present with you, even though you don't feel it at the moment. And that's where I think the term blessed is probably helpful.
I'm reminded of another person in Nashville. While she was not directly talking about blessing, she offered a metaphor which I find helpful, Becca Stevens, when she says, you might just be in the presence of God when you don't know who is giving and receiving. And that's got a lovely sensibility for me on a relational level as well as on a spiritual level, because it goes beyond just a gift exchange. There's something going on there that is whatever this would be, you know, yoke, covenanted. I don't know. I thought I would just throw that in.
Yeah,
and of
I've
course
not heard that. I like it. And here's why I like it. Not only because I like Becca, who I think is a very wise woman. In gift exchange in general, there's a sense of reciprocity that's required. You give me something, I have to give you something back. You know, it's the idea is like there's no free lunch, right? See,
right.
What happens if you don't know who the giver and who the receiver is? Then there's no concern for reciprocity, because you're both giving and you're both receiving. It's all taken care of. So it doesn't put anybody in the power position, and it doesn't make anybody feel in debt to the other. So that's a very nice metaphor.
So then, if to turn it to a little bit, what we might say for people who are listening to this, who want to know, how do I use this in my life?
Yeah.
There's a sense perhaps that being blessed is both something one receives and something that then one pays forward or pays back as one can. So blessing is an obligation in a sense, not merely a state of being.
Yes, because some of the Beatitudes insist on a pay it forward model. Peacemaking means you have to continue to do it. Meek means you have to continue to do it. If you want to go proclaim the gospel and people might say awful things about you, you still have to continue to do it. And I think even with something like hungering and thirsting for righteousness, if you stop doing that, if I would stop doing that, I would die from hunger and thirst. I mean, I can't see myself stopping that, right? Because I always want more of that. But I do think that human beings are hardwired to be selfish. I think we're hardwired for self-preservation. So hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and I'm not sure it can be taught, that may be a gift. And if you have that gift that you can actually do that and you recognize it, then if you're theologically inclined, blessed is a very good term for that. But I know many people who really don't hunger and thirst for righteousness. They hunger and thirst for fame or beauty or money or power.
So I'd like to go back to study and learning if we can. And I have a recent experience that I'd like to share with you. I went to a workshop of the College of Congregational Development to think about revitalizing the congregations. There were Episcopalians and Lutherans there, and they talked about their 5 items that are important relative to revitalizing a community of faith or a congregation, of which one is studying and learning.
Good.
And so, indeed, and what was fascinating is I think how are you and how are your congregation in terms of in terms of these 5 elements? And the lowest of them across the board was study and learning.
Yep.
And so if you were to come to Christ Memorial Episcopal Church in Danville, Pennsylvania, where we have had the St. John's Bible, or gone to St. Paul's Bloomsburg, the other church I'm currently serving, where they actually have a lovely adult Christian education program, what would be the messages you, coming from your position on the compass, have to say about, hey guys, Jesus is teaching disciples, and that includes you? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm a big fan of church-based adult education programs. And I've been writing curricula for church-based adult education programs, which is in part where we're talking, because I wrote this book on the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And then we actually did filming for the Sermon on the Mount. So how do you open this up so that it becomes friendly and you're not expected or held to account because you don't know the answer to something? One nice way of starting such classes, if you want to do something on the Sermon on the Mount, or any sort of gospel or New Testament, Old Testament text, Old Testament, perfectly good word for Christians to use, is to begin by saying, you read the text and then you say, what does this text mean to me? What does it remind me of? What words strike me as interesting? Do I remember hearing this when I was a kid? So if you can begin the class not as a class, which sounds like, we're going to have to take an exam at the end, or a lesson, which sounds even more boring, but as a conversation about the Sermon on the Mount. And so, because the more you know about the needs and concerns of your class or your congregation, the more effective teacher you can be. In fact, the more effective priest you can be.
I love what you said about conversation. Is one thing that's happening post-COVID. We can have conversations now that are different, that are more fluid, perhaps, and are not as formal. And there are leaders in every chair. There are people who have experiences.
Well, that's pretty much how it functions in the Jewish tradition. So the rabbi, your congregational rabbi, is supposed to know more about Jewish tradition and liturgy than everybody else. So the rabbi can then direct traffic in a sense. But the congregation is supposed to do that same type of studying. And that's the idea thing, is you continue to study. It's called learning. So you just continue to learn. It used to be just a male thing, but now women are increasingly doing this, whether in together groups or whether just in separate women Torah studies.
Think of benchmarks beyond your own synagogue that you might want to highlight?
There are a couple of, I did before COVID, a lot of scholar in residence programs. It's Friday night through Sunday noonish. And the programs that I find particularly rewarding are those when I get to meet with high school youth. And these wonderful moments where some of these kids would come to me and say, I'm a lesbian, and if I tell my parents, they're going to say the Bible's against that, and what do I do? How fabulous. Or I'm reading this text and it all seems just like a lot of bull to me, and I don't see any value in it whatsoever. And why do I keep having to do this? And I can say, well, okay, I'm not a Christian, but I see some value here. See it through my eyes and see if this works for you. It may not, but see if it works for you. Or my parents are getting divorced and Jesus forbids divorce, so are my parents going to go to hell? Right? These are real questions. Those are marvelous moments because they provide an opportunity to tell kids the Bible is a usable resource. Here are some techniques by which you can read it so that you can find sustenance and you can find meaning. And you have the freedom to ask questions of it rather than just take it like sheep. So stop behaving like sheep. It's a terrible metaphor. I like the moments where somebody clearly older than I am says, I never thought about the text that way. Parables are, you mentioned parables before, Howie. Parables are great fun on that. So I'll tell them a parable and here's how I read it. And then look at me and go, wow, yeah, that fits. That makes sense. I like that so much better.
There is a responsibility to being a person of faith, and that does include this call to be studious, to be a learner, and to be a disciple. So I'm just very grateful for that reminder.
Thank you. Let's take the both and on that. Yes, we have to continue to study, and it's our responsibility, and we should not cede that responsibility to the clergy. God bless you both, because it's a responsibility of anybody who considers a personal identity as disciple, whether in the Jewish tradition or in the Christian tradition. I can't speak for others, but I suspect it's the same thing. But in terms of the both and, there is the pragmatic, and we can't let that go. But I also don't want to let go of those other things that are not necessarily pragmatic, but are sustaining. The non-limited or the infinite, or the sense of just who you are without even having to do anything, that sense that you are already blessed, which for some person is ego strength, and that's a good thing to have. And for other people, it's a sense of this palpable feeling of the divine. For others, it might be aesthetics. Consider the lilies of the field, also part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? So you pay attention to nature, take time out to smell the flowers, that sort of thing. Because you can't be doing good works all the time in terms of helping others. You got to do stuff to sustain yourself. You can't be the light of the world if you're continually being drained. And that's that you'll always have the poor with you, but sometimes you need to do something for yourself. And sometimes you need to do something really extravagant for somebody who might need it. You've just come out of pandemic. You're just finally appearing in public. You've got the courage to go out and let me take you out and buy you the most fabulous dinner. And you haven't had something like that in 2 years. How sustaining that is. And the Sermon on the Mount allows for that as well.
Thank you. Howie, do you have any takeaways you'd like to offer?
I'm grateful always for the reminder that Jesus and his followers were deeply learned in the Tanakh, that they knew all these references. And so when they speak, they're speaking to each other in a way that in some ways is lost on some of us now, in that we have lost some of those references as immediate touchstones.
Yeah.
But it's really useful to remember that they are profoundly influenced by what they have read. They were observant Jews.
Yeah. And they probably debated Torah too, and I'm not sure they could read, but they knew this stuff really well, because they would hear it every week. I mean, it's their culture. When I was a kid, back when Noah was still on the ark, there were 4 television stations, okay, because there were 3 networks plus PBS, and everybody watched the same TV shows. So everybody had a common vocabulary, and you could presume it. Right? We don't have that anymore because technology has given us too much to distract ourselves. So it used to be that people would know their Bibles because, everybody in kind of greater America, pretty much everybody was Christian, and pretty much every Christian went to church, and pretty much every Christian heard the Bible being read. We don't have that anymore. Biblical literacy is enormously high. You just make up quotes and say, is that in the Bible? Yeah, absolutely. Starve a cold and feed a fever. Yeah, Leviticus 12. Just make stuff up. So because we lack that common vocabulary, we lack a sense of what the disciples and Jesus would have known, and therefore, in fact, what I think a great much of Matthew's audience would have known, whether Jewish or Gentile, because the only Bible they have would have been the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. That's their text.
Mm, mm.
So the more deeply you seep yourself in what the church comes to call the Old Testament, the better you can understand Jesus, because that's the common vocabulary from which he's drawing.
I was just going to say before I invited you prior to the podcast to read the Beatitudes from a translation. And so just prior to that, if you have any other sort of concluding nugget of gold that you'd like to offer, and if not, if you would offer the reading of the Beatitudes, I would be very grateful, and I'm sure Howie would be as well, and our listeners.
I can do that. So here's the nugget, because it always helps. I mean, for me to end with a rabbinic commentary. There's a rabbinic commentary from a text called Perkei Avot, which is like the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' greatest hits. Avot is the rabbi's greatest hits. It means ethics of the fathers. And it's talking about Torah. It's like turn it and turn it because everything is in it. And then it goes on to say, it is not your duty to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. Which means that every time you look at Torah, and I would extend that to the New Testament, you're going to see new things because it's like a faceted gem, and each time you turn it, the light hits it differently, so you get this different reaction. Because you're never the same person when you approach the text. Different things will have happened to you, or you would have, listened to a different podcast, or seen a TV show, or heard music, and now I see something I hadn't seen before. And don't worry about getting all the answers, because you're never going to get them all anyway. You're never going to understand fully what this thing means, because somebody else is going to come along with a different perspective, asking a different question. That's why we need diverse audiences to ask diverse questions, because the more different your cultural base is, you're going to start asking different questions. That's always helpful. So don't worry about getting all the right answers. Worry about just ask the right questions, or start asking questions, and you're probably in a good shape. Seeing the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And when he sat, came to him his disciples, and opening his mouth, he was teaching them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. Blessed are the ones mourning, because they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, because they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the ones hungering and thirsting for righteousness, because they will be fully fed. Blessed are the merciful, because they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the ones who are clean in heart, because they, God, will see. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they, sons of God, will be called. Blessed are the ones persecuted on account of righteousness, because theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. Blessed are you when they reproach you, and they persecute, and they say every evil thing against you, lying on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is much in the heavens. For thuswise they persecuted the prophets, the ones before you. By the way, that word I translated fully fed can also be translated gorged. And if we wanted to be a little bit less formal, because I think this is kind of formal, I would say stuffed.
It's a segue point or something, but I feel fully stuffed in a delightful way. Like I had the second piece of cheesecake from Cheesecake Factory or something,
Nice.
So I'm just very grateful. This has been a blessing for me.
It's been a joy for me to talk with you both. Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Please share our podcasts with your friends, family, and anyone traveling along the way seeking wisdom and hope in these extraordinary times. There are many resources associated with this podcast series. Most of the commentaries, comments, and other thought-provoking materials are available at Beatitudes.Online. We have a subscribers list you can sign up for too. This series and earlier podcasts of ours are located at circuosity.podbean.com. Check it out, and we invite you to follow and like us on Facebook. Please let us know if you'd like for us to share information with you and your faith communities, either virtually or with other forms of promotional materials. Next time, we will begin exploring each beatitude on its own. Join us as we converse with the Reverend Dr. Manoj Zakaria. Manoj is the rector of St. Anne's Episcopal Church in Annapolis, Maryland. He is a brilliant theologian, pastor, and preacher who will offer all of us many deep and faithful ideas about Matthew 5:3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Until then, be well, be present, and blessings to you along the way.